If you're thinking of a fantasy epic, you may have the idea of a heroic knight swinging around a flail and knocking a dragon dead. And there's one problem with that, and it's that the flail doesn't exist. Dragons unconfirmed. No. So basically, we all have this idea, but maybe from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, maybe from Lord of the Rings, that there's this weapon.
Various cartoons.
There's various cartoons where there's just the weapon. It's basically like a rod with a chain attached to it and a spiked ball at the end of that. No one actually wielded that weapon, according to one researcher. That's Paul B. Sturdivant, who wrote this article. His work, The Curious Case of the Weapon That Didn't Exist, which sounds very intriguing, and it really is.
It is. I mean, and this is the thing, like some people will call it a mace or a morningstar, and those are different terms, different things. Like the mace is essentially...
It's the rod.
Yeah, it's a
battery.
Yeah, it's like a club, basically. And if it has spikes on it, then it's a morningstar. And so, like, this is talking about a flail. There's a two-handed flail, and that exists. What he's saying is that the one-handed flail, which has a chain and then a ball or a spiked ball, which would be a morningstar flail, that does not exist outside of fantasy stories.
Yeah, we made it up, basically.
Yeah,
and we can go through the history of who made it up and what happened with that.
And it's impractical. With a mace or a sword, you need a follow-through. And by the nature of this design, the one-handed flail, like, any follow-through increases the chance that it's going to go back to you and injure you, especially if it bounces off a shield or glances off armor.
It's just too much to account for in the heat of battle. And it could probably end up doing more harm than good, at least for you.
You could take out your buddy before you take out the enemy.
For sure.
Yeah.
Or you could hit yourself and wing open your skull.
Yeah.
Famously, in The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, Peter Jackson did give the Witch King this weapon, a big version of this, and that was called by Richard Taylor ridiculous and unable to be used almost at all as a prop even. It is entirely a fantasy weapon, even in the history of real people who existed and wielded weapons.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest depictions we seem to find of it is from artists rather than weapons makers.
Yeah, according to the writer here, the researcher, he couldn't find any depictions of it being used in a historical reference. He actually did go to the Met and talk to Dr. Nicholas Duprat, who is an expert in medieval arms and armor, and they went through a bunch of different I guess you could call them flails or flail-like weapons. And, they found that, for instance, one of them is actually a horsewhip, not a military weapon. So you could argue that much as far. He calls the chain flimsy. He calls it a basis for a cat o' nine tails, as opposed to a military weapon or a soldier's weapon. It's also described, going through the list, ceremonial. Not used for weapons at all as a practical thing. You were talking about art manuscripts, which is where it starts to get really interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you go into some of the older stories, and the first two are from manuscript editions of the Travels of Marco Polo. And they're said to be held by warriors from the Middle East. But, like, by definition, so many of these things, when people went off and traveled to places and then told what they'd seen, like, people would reinterpret that in some bizarre ways and give, like, it gave rise to various myths of what those faraway lands contain and what strange
these
ways.
Wild, crazy weapons. Because if you look at a flail, it looks crazy. It looks like you can imagine it being swung around, causing all this damage. It does certainly feed into the myth, this legend of this horrifying, scary group of people who could kill you.
Well, it's also, I think it's close enough to a sling that you had people thinking like, oh, sure, that makes sense because the sling works.
That could be a thing.
But no, like the sling by definition actually operates by various, very different principles and is a different form of attack. Just because they both involve you swinging something doesn't mean they're going to work the same way.
So basically, a flail is it's a simulacra. It's something that was created as
the one-handed flail.
A copy of something, yes, this specific one. A copy of something that never actually existed. It's the original fan build, if you will. Props, cosplay.
Geek.
So yeah, the original nerds made this canon. It's interesting to think that we've thought, oh, this is a thing, it's scary and real. But really, the human mind or the human artistic mind is what created it after all. Audience, what weapon would you like to see, or fantasy weapon, see kind of brought to life in real life? That is what I think this essentially is. Kinda. You can make that argument. Let us know below in the comments, so please like and subscribe for more.